She was never really here. She just floated around under the ocean, pretending it mattered, while I built all of this. I stood quietly in the hallway of the restaurant I had paid to build, listening to my husband tell our accountant that my 20 years in the United States Navy amounted to an extended vacation. He was setting the stage to vote me out of our business entirely, assuming a retired female submariner would simply fold under pressure. To understand how I let him think he was winning right up until the final moment, I have to take you back. My name is Teresa. I am 45 years old. For 20 of those years, I wore the gold fouled anchor of a chief petty officer. My specific rating was nuclear machinist's mate, and I served almost my entire career underway on fast attack submarines. Most people have a cinematic view of the Navy. They picture aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean or sleek destroyers cutting through sunlit waves. I did not serve in that surface Navy. My reality was a windowless steel cylinder submerged hundreds of feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Submarine life is defined by extreme isolation. You breathe manufactured air that smells faintly of floor wax machine oil and amine. You sleep in a rack no wider than your shoulders, often stacked 3 high. You go 90 days without seeing the sun, feeling a breeze, or hearing a single spoken word from your family. My watch station was deep in the engine room, turning heavy wrenches and maintaining the pressurized nuclear reactor that gave the boat power. It was grueling, dangerous work. As a woman in the submarine force, you learn very quickly that the machinery does not care about your gender. It only cares about your competence. One mistake with a high-pressure steam valve could cause a catastrophic casualty. One failure in the cooling systems could cripple the submarine in hostile waters. We relied entirely on discipline and rigorous procedure. Facts over feelings. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. You learn to control a chaotic environment by paying absolute attention to the details. That discipline kept me alive in the dark, but it demanded a heavy, silent price back on the surface. Being a mother who deploys on a submarine carries a very specific, agonizing kind of guilt. If you have ever carried a heavy, invisible burden in silence to protect the financial future of the people you love, you know exactly how that feels. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to be the quiet anchor for your family. My husband, Robert, paid a price too. We married when I was 22, right after I finished the punishing nuclear training pipeline in South Carolina. He was brilliant, fiercely organized, and he had a massive dream. He wanted to own and operate a restaurant, not a simple diner, but a proper coastal kitchen with seasonal menus and a full staff. He knew the hospitality industry inside and out, but we did not have a single dime of capital. I told him I would find the money, not because it would be easy, but because it was our shared mission. The military compensates submariners for the sheer misery of their environment. Between sea pay, submarine duty incentive pay, hazardous duty pay, and re-enlistment bonuses, a sailor who spends her entire career underway can generate significant capital. So I volunteered for every arduous sea billet. I took the longest, hardest deployments. While other young sailors were buying new trucks or drinking away their shore leave in foreign ports, I saved everything. I lived on stale coffee and ship food. I kept my personal expenses to roughly $40 a month. Every extra dollar I made went straight to Robert for what we called the Shore Fund. When the time finally came to secure a commercial lease in a busy waterfront district, I was on a 6-month deployment in the South China Sea. I could not be there to view the property or meet with the local municipality. I simply wired $40,000 of my hazardous duty pay from a secure military terminal and trusted him to execute the plan. When the kitchen needed commercial-grade ovens and massive walk-in freezers a year later, I wired another $60,000 from 2 back-to-back re-enlistment bonuses. Over a decade, I funneled more than $120,000 of hard-earned military pay directly into the foundation of his restaurant. Because I was gone so often, we agreed he would handle the legal mechanics. He set up the limited liability company. He registered the business licenses. He dealt with the local tax authorities and the payroll vendors. We were equal partners, but I left the administrative controls completely in his hands. In the submarine force, you learn to blindly trust the sailor standing watch next to you. If you second-guess your crewmates during a casualty, the boat sinks. I applied that exact same logic to my marriage. I kept the reactor running, and I assumed he was keeping our financial books just as watertight. The restaurant was a massive success. It quickly became a staple in our coastal town. We eventually brought on 2 minority partners to help fund a large outdoor patio expansion, and we hired an accountant to handle the growing daily revenue. When I did manage to come home on leave, I would sit quietly in a corner booth, drinking black coffee, just watching Robert command the dining room. He was magnificent in his element. I felt a quiet, profound pride, knowing that my sacrifices in the dark had built this bright, loud, well-lit room. I never asked for a round of applause. I just looked forward to the day I could finally participate. I desperately wanted to be there for our son and daughter, who are now young adults navigating college and early careers. I had missed their early years, leaving Robert to act as the primary parent while I funded our lives. It was a reality that weighed heavily on my conscience. I convinced myself that my eventual retirement would balance the scales. I pictured myself taking over the back office, managing the logistics, and giving Robert a chance to finally rest and enjoy what we had built together. Sometimes the hardest part of a long patrol is not the isolation. Sometimes it is the false reality you build in your head about what is waiting for you back on the pier. I had spent thousands of hours in the dark imagining a bright, shared future. I assumed Robert valued my hazardous duty just as much as I valued his management and parenting. When I reached exactly 20 years of service, I submitted my papers. My commanding officer shook my hand, gave me my discharge certificate, and thanked me for my time in the dark. I drove home as a civilian. I was finally ready to share in the dream I had funded. I walked into the restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a small cardboard box containing my military plaques and coffee mugs. I walked past the busy kitchen and went straight to the back office we were supposed to share. The room was perfectly organized, but there was only one desk. There was only one chair. My name was nowhere on the framed business licenses hanging on the wall. Robert walked into the office a moment later. He did not smile. He did not offer a hug to welcome his wife back to the surface for good. He looked at my box of plaques, sighed heavily, and closed the solid wooden door behind him. He stood leaning against the desk I had paid for, crossing his arms over his chest. He calmly informed me that my administrative access to the business accounts had been revoked that morning. And before I could even process what he was saying, he handed me a sealed white envelope. He told me he wanted a separation, and he expected me to find a new place to live by Friday. I did not yell. I did not throw the separation papers back across the desk. I am a retired Navy chief. When a high-pressure line ruptures in a submarine engine room, panic is a contagious disease that gets people killed. You silence the alarm, you assess the casualty, and you move methodically to isolate the leak. Facts over feelings. I simply picked up my cardboard box, put the white envelope in my jacket pocket, and walked out the back door of the restaurant. I rented a very small, very plain apartment on the edge of town the following morning. It had a single window that overlooked a busy highway, and the walls were painted a sterile, depressing beige. It felt remarkably like a submarine berthing compartment, which gave me a strange, twisted sense of comfort. I unpacked my sea bags, set up a folding chair in the living room, and sat down to read the paperwork Robert had handed me. The legal language was aggressive, but the core demand was very simple. He was not just asking for a physical separation of our marriage. He was setting the stage to formally sever me from the business entirely. I thought keeping the peace would shield our adult children from the blast radius. Our son Michael was finishing an engineering degree at a state university. Our daughter Sarah was working her first corporate job in a neighboring city. They were both intelligent, driven kids, but they had grown up largely with Robert as their primary parent. I was just the mother who sent letters from foreign ports and occasionally showed up to disrupt their routines before vanishing back underwater. I assumed Robert would at least respect the boundary of keeping the children out of a financial dispute. I assumed wrong. A week after I moved into the apartment, Sarah called me. Her voice was strained, caught somewhere between confusion and deep resentment. "Dad said you showed up demanding half the restaurant," Sarah said. She was speaking fast, highly protective of her father. "He said you never helped build it, that you just left him alone to raise us and do all the work while you lived rent-free on a submarine." I gripped the phone tightly. Rent-free on a submarine. It was an incredibly cruel way to describe sleeping on a steel shelf while breathing recycled air next to an active nuclear reactor. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "That is not accurate." "Then what is the truth?" she snapped back.
Dad has the ledgers. He has the operating agreements. He said your name is not on the original funding documents. He said you just used the Navy as a shield to avoid being a real mother.
Robert had not just filed for separation. He had launched a highly coordinated preemptive strike against my character. Society expects a father to deploy for work, but when a mother does it, the narrative is often weaponized against her. Robert was leaning into that exact prejudice. He was using the very isolation I endured to support them financially as a weapon to destroy my relationship with my children. He was framing my military service as an unnatural abandonment of maternal duty rather than a sacrifice. I realized then that this was not a simple emotional marital dispute. This was a hostile corporate takeover. To execute a hostile takeover, you need to convince the other stakeholders that the target is a liability. Robert had already started lobbying our 2 minority partners and our accountant. The minority partners were local investors who had bought into the business 5 years ago to fund a massive patio expansion. The accountant, a sharp guy named Marcus, handled all the daily revenue and tax filings. None of them knew me. They only knew the version of me that Robert presented. I started hearing rumors from former colleagues and local vendors. Robert was telling anyone who would listen that my military career was just a selfish excuse to avoid real work and motherhood. He claimed I only came home to eat free food and play the returning hero, while he carried the crushing weight of entrepreneurship and single fatherhood. He was relying heavily on a specific, deeply flawed assumption. He assumed that a female mechanic who spent her life turning wrenches in the dark would be completely out of her depth in a civilian business dispute. He thought I was just a tired, guilty mother who would fold under the sophisticated pressure of legal threats and accounting jargon. Overconfident adversaries always make the same fatal mistake. They assume your silence is a symptom of weakness, rather than a sign of disciplined restraint. If you have ever had to bite your tongue and let someone dig their own grave with lies, you know exactly how much discipline that takes. Tell me how you handled it in the comments below. I did not immediately call him to argue. Not because I was afraid of the conflict, but because arguing gives your opponent valuable data about your emotional state. Instead, I went to a local coffee shop, opened my laptop, and began quietly gathering intelligence. I checked the public business registries. I reviewed the state laws regarding limited liability companies. I needed to understand his exact legal mechanism before I countered. He could not just legally erase my 50% ownership stake simply because he was angry. He needed a mechanism. 2 days later, the mechanism arrived in the mail. A delivery driver knocked on my apartment door and handed me a thick, certified envelope. The return address belonged to a high-priced corporate litigation firm in the city. I sat at my small kitchen table, put on my reading glasses, and opened the document. It was a formal notice of an emergency partners meeting scheduled for the following Thursday in the restaurant's private dining room. The agenda was spelled out in cold, precise legal language. Robert had formally petitioned the minority partners and the accountant to execute a hostile removal vote. He was triggering a buried clause in our original limited liability agreement. The clause was designed to eject a partner who demonstrated a failure to materially contribute to the daily operations and financial solvency of the business. He was legally asserting that all the early funding had come from a generic family savings account entirely managed and generated by him. He claimed that because I had never worked a single shift in the kitchen, had never managed staff, and had never been present for daily operations, my ownership stake was completely invalid. But the real knife twist was buried on page 4. His lawyer had drafted a buyout agreement. Because they claimed I had contributed 0 equity and 0 labor, they were generously offering to buy out my half of the multi-million-dollar business for exactly $0. In exchange for my signature on the surrender document, they would agree not to sue me for back wages for the massive administrative labor and solo parenting Robert had supposedly done on my behalf. It was not just a legal maneuver. It was a complete erasure of my life's work as a provider and a mother. I reviewed the document 3 times. My breathing slowed down. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. He really believed he could just rewrite history. He really thought that because he handled the paperwork ashore, he controlled reality. He assumed I was just an exhausted woman who would not know how to fight a corporate legal ambush. He was right about one thing. I had not worked a single shift in his kitchen. I had been busy maintaining a nuclear reactor in hostile waters so he could buy that kitchen. I set the document on the table and looked at my old green sea bags resting in the corner of the room. The game board was finally clear. The leak was isolated. Now I needed to rig for silent running. The certified legal notice sat on my folding table for 3 days. I treated it like a casualty report, studying every single word until I understood the exact mechanics of his ambush. Robert was not just trying to force a separation. He was orchestrating a complete financial execution. His attorney had drafted a petition to trigger a removal clause in our operating agreement. To make it legal, he had to prove to our minority partners and our accountant Marcus that my equity was a complete illusion. He was asserting that I had failed to materially contribute any financial capital or physical labor to the restaurant's solvency. To pull this off, he had to heavily doctor the internal history of our finances. I knew Robert was incredibly meticulous with ledgers. He would never submit an outright forged bank document to a room full of investors. That was a federal crime. Instead, he had simply sanitized the narrative. He would show Marcus the final step of the money trail, the checks he wrote from our joint domestic account to the commercial leasing agent and the restaurant equipment vendors. He would completely omit the origin of the funds. He would erase the initial wire transfers I had sent from foreign military bases that filled that joint account in the first place. Because he managed the administrative side of our marriage, he held the pen. If Marcus only looked at the final business ledgers, he would only see Robert writing the checks. He would never see the submarine pay that made those checks possible. To Marcus and to the minority partners, I truly looked like an absentee mother who had contributed absolutely nothing. A lesser woman might have hired an aggressive divorce attorney, frozen the business accounts, and dragged the entire restaurant into a messy, destructive public court battle. But destroying the restaurant would destroy my children's eventual inheritance and ruin the livelihoods of our 50 employees. I did not want to sink the boat. I just wanted to remove the mutineer. If you have ever had someone try to weaponize your sacrifices just to make themselves look like the hero, tell me how you handled it in the comments below. This was the moment I realized his trap relied entirely on the assumption that the original paper trail no longer existed. He assumed that because the early transactions happened while I was submerged in the Pacific Ocean 15 years ago, I would not have access to the files. That was a fundamental misunderstanding of how a female nuclear machinist's mate operates. When you spend your life turning wrenches on a pressurized reactor in a male-dominated environment, you constantly have to prove your competence. Because of that, you become violently protective of your documentation. You log every valve turn, every maintenance check, and every single action taken in the engine room. I carried that exact same rigid discipline into my personal finances. I walked over to the corner of my sterile apartment and unzipped my heavy green canvas sea bag. I dug past my old blue coveralls and my steel-toed boots. At the very bottom, wrapped in heavy waterproof plastic, was a thick black accordion folder. I carried the folder to the folding table and opened it. Inside were 2 decades of pristine, chronological financial files. When you were deployed on a submarine 15 years ago, you did not simply log into a digital application to move $40,000. You had to physically walk into the boat's tiny administrative office and sit down with the yeoman. The yeoman would draft a formal, hard-copy military wire transfer request. The commanding officer had to sign it. Most importantly, they always generated a yellow carbon copy receipt, heavily stamped with the boat's official seal and the exact date. I pulled out a faded yellow receipt from Yokosuka, Japan. It clearly showed $40,000 moving directly from my individual military pay account into the civilian account Robert used to secure the commercial lease. I pulled out another receipt, this one from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, showing a $60,000 transfer from a re-enlistment bonus directly to the commercial kitchen equipment vendor. Every single receipt bore my signature, my military identification number, and the official stamp of the United States Navy. The joint checking account narrative was a lie. The financial proof was solid. It completely obliterated his claim that I had contributed zero capital. But financial files were only half the equation. Robert was also heavily leaning on the sexist prejudice that my time in the Navy was an abandonment of motherhood, not real work. He was legally framing my military service as a prolonged absence, telling the partners that I had basically been on a 20-year vacation from responsibility, while he built an empire and raised our kids. I needed to shatter that illusion completely. A spreadsheet could prove I provided the money, but a spreadsheet could not defend the grueling reality of my labor. For that, I needed eyewitnesses. I picked up my cell phone and made 2 calls. The first call was to a man named David. David had been my commanding officer on my second submarine, a brilliant, tough-as-nails captain, who was now a retired rear admiral residing 3 towns over. David had signed 2 of those exact wire transfer receipts himself. The second call was to a man named William Vance, a fellow engineering chief. We had stood watch together in the engine room for 6 solid years. He was one of the few people on Earth who truly understood exactly how much sweat and blood I had left on those steel deck plates to prove I belonged there. He was still working as a civilian shipyard inspector nearby. I briefly explained the situation to both men. I kept it completely factual, stripping away the emotion. I told them my husband was legally claiming my military deployments were essentially a vacation to avoid raising my children, and I needed witnesses to establish the factual reality of what I was doing while Robert was building the restaurant. Military men who have seen you bleed in the dark do not mince words, and they do not hesitate when a sister is under fire. David simply asked for the address and the time. Chief Vance asked if he needed to wear a suit or if his standard work boots and flannel shirt would be sufficient to make a lawyer uncomfortable. The trap was fully set. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment running perfectly silent. I ignored aggressive text messages from Robert's attorney, demanding I sign the $0 surrender document early. I ignored the noise. Thursday morning arrived, the morning of the emergency partners meeting. I put on a sharp charcoal blazer I had bought specifically for civilian life. I polished my flat leather shoes until they gleamed. I pinned my gold Chief's anchor to my lapel. I placed the yellow carbon copy receipts into a single slim manila folder and tucked it under my arm. I drove to the restaurant and parked in the back alley. The lunch rush had not yet started. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors and headed straight for the private dining room in the back. Through the glass panes of the door, I could see them all gathered. Robert was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. He was wearing a sharp designer suit, looking every bit the successful self-made executive and dedicated father. Next to him sat his attorney, leaning back with a smug, relaxed posture. The accountant sat near them, nervously tapping a pen against a stack of thick financial ledgers. The two minority partners sat at the far end, looking impatiently at their watches. I pushed the door open and walked inside. Robert looked up. A tight, confident smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked at the single thin folder under my arm and then at his lawyer's towering stack of binders. He saw a woman walking into an ambush without legal representation. He was completely confident that I was showing up empty-handed to surrender. The private dining room smelled heavily of roasted garlic and the expensive imported coffee I had paid to source. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked the length of the long mahogany table. There was exactly one open seat remaining. It was placed at the far end, deliberately positioned as far away from Robert as possible. I did not complain about the seating arrangement. I simply sat down, placed my single thin manila folder flat on the table, and folded my hands over it. Robert did not offer a greeting. He simply nodded to the man sitting next to him. His attorney was young, wearing a sharply tailored suit and a condescending smile. He was clearly accustomed to dominating a room through sheer volume and aggressive posturing. He opened a massive leather binder and spread his documents across the table like a general deploying troops. Let us get straight to the facts. The lawyer began addressing the room but keeping his eyes firmly fixed on me. We are here today to formally execute Section 4 of the operating agreement, specifically the clause that permits the immediate removal of any partner who completely fails to materially contribute to the daily operations or the financial solvency of this enterprise. He paused, letting the heavy legal phrasing hang in the air. Over the last decade, the lawyer continued, my client Robert has built this highly successful restaurant from the ground up. He negotiated the commercial lease. He managed the complex supply chains. He handled the payroll, the hiring, and the daily grueling grind of running a multi-million-dollar hospitality business. And he did all of this while simultaneously serving as a single father to 2 children. He was the sole operational engine of this family and this company. He leaned forward, pointing a silver pen directly at me. During that exact same time frame, Teresa has been entirely absent. She claims a 50% ownership stake, yet she contributed absolutely zero physical labor to the success of this company and provided zero daily support to her household. The 2 minority partners, local real estate investors, who only cared about their quarterly dividends, nodded slowly. From their perspective, the lawyer was stating objective facts. They were looking at me with open judgment, clearly believing they were staring at a deadbeat mother trying to leech off her hard-working, dedicated husband. They had bought into his narrative completely. The lawyer then turned his attention to Marcus, our accountant. Furthermore, we must address the financial capital, the lawyer said, his voice rising with theatrical confidence. He slid a thick stack of printed banking ledgers toward the center of the table. Marcus, you have reviewed these ledgers extensively. Could you please confirm for the board who signed the initial funding checks during the critical startup phase? Marcus looked incredibly uncomfortable. He was a numbers man, caught in the middle of a deeply personal crossfire. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at his yellow legal pad, avoiding my gaze entirely. Based on the records provided for the initial capitalization phase, Marcus said nervously, his voice slightly shaking, The original $40,000 commercial lease deposit was drawn directly from a domestic checking account. A subsequent $60,000 payment for commercial kitchen equipment was drawn from that exact same account a year later. All the checks clearing that account were signed solely by Robert. "Thank you, Marcus," the lawyer said smoothly, taking back control of the room. "As you can see, the financial record is indisputable. Robert provided the initial capital from an account he managed. He provided all the labor. Teresa simply put her name on a piece of paper, offering nothing of value in return." Robert leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound satisfaction washing over his face. He had successfully steered the narrative exactly where he wanted it. He had completely erased my origin from the money, weaponizing his role as the primary parent to justify stealing my equity. He then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and decided to deliver the final, emotional blow. "Teresa," Robert said, his voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I know this is hard for you to hear, but this business and raising those kids was my life's work. You were never really here. You just floated around under the ocean pretending it mattered while I built all of this." It was the exact line I had heard him say to the accountant in the hallway weeks ago. But this time, he was delivering it to a captive audience. It was a highly calculated insult, heavily weaponizing a mother's guilt, designed to humiliate me into submission. He wanted me to lose my temper. He wanted me to shout, to cry, to throw a tantrum, and prove to the room that I was an unstable emotional liability who deserved to be cut loose. In the submarine force, when an adversary actively pings your hull with sonar, the worst thing you can do is make noise and reveal your exact position. You do not return fire immediately. You rig for silent running. You let them waste their energy pinging the empty ocean. You let them exhaust their arguments, build their false confidence, and massively overplay their hand. I did not yell. I did not glare at him. I simply let the silence stretch out in the room for a long, incredibly uncomfortable 10 seconds. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. My calm tone deeply unsettled the lawyer. He frowned slightly, clearly thrown off by my complete lack of panic, tears, or outrage. "We are finished presenting the reality of the situation," the lawyer replied sharply, trying to regain his momentum. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a crisp, stapled document, and slid it exactly halfway down the mahogany table. "This is a formal equity dissolution agreement," the lawyer announced, dropping his voice to a serious, commanding register. "Given that you provided zero initial capital and zero operational labor, we are offering a $0 buyout. We are calling for an immediate, formal vote right now to remove you from the business structure entirely." He tapped his silver pen against the table, glaring at me. "However, if you voluntarily sign this surrender document today," the lawyer threatened, "my client will agree not to sue you for back wages regarding the massive administrative labor and child-rearing he was forced to perform entirely on his own during your 20 years of absence. It is the cleanest, quietest way forward. Sign the paper, Teresa." The document sat on the polished wood, resting just inches from my thin manila folder. It was a complete clinical erasure of my life's work. It was a legal demand that I admit my military career was worthless, and that my painful sacrifices away from my children meant absolutely nothing. The entire room stared at me, waiting for my inevitable surrender. They expected the guilty mother to fold. I did not reach for the pen. I did not even look at the threatening contract. Instead, I looked down at my wrist and calmly checked my watch. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. I looked up from my watch and locked eyes with the accountant. "Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level and quiet, "would you please do me a favor and open the heavy double doors behind you?" Marcus blinked, clearly deeply uncomfortable with the request. He glanced at Robert, who gave a sharp, irritated shake of his head, but the quiet, unyielding authority in my voice left Marcus with very little room to decline. He awkwardly pushed his chair back, stood up, and pulled the brass handles of the double doors. Standing in the hallway were two men. The first man wore an impeccably tailored navy blue suit with a small gold pin resting on the lapel. He carried the quiet, heavy authority of a man who was used to giving orders that dictated life or death. This was retired Rear Admiral David, my former commanding officer. The second man was built like a brick wall. He had kept his promise about his attire. He was wearing heavy denim jeans, scuffed steel-toed work boots, and a thick flannel shirt. His hands were thick and permanently calloused. This was retired Chief Petty Officer William Vance, the man who had stood watch next to me in the engine room for 6 grueling years. They walked into the private dining room together. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly. The smug, relaxed energy evaporated from the room. Robert sat up straight, his confident smile vanishing. His young lawyer stopped tapping his silver pen and frowned deeply. "Excuse me," the lawyer said, attempting to display his courtroom authority. "This is a private, highly confidential legal proceeding. You gentlemen need to leave the premises immediately." Admiral David did not even blink. He walked directly to the center of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the lawyer, and looked at the two minority partners. "I am retired Rear Admiral David of the United States Navy," he announced. His voice was not loud, but it carried absolute, uncompromising command. "I am here at the formal request of Chief Petty Officer Teresa, an equal stakeholder in this company." The Admiral rested his hands on the back of an empty chair. "I understand there is an assertion being made in this room today," the Admiral continued smoothly, "that this woman failed to provide physical labor or material contribution to your business. I am told her deployment history has been characterized as a 20-year vacation from responsibility." He pointed a single finger directly at me. "When you were sleeping comfortably in your civilian beds," the Admiral said, his tone turning cold and sharp, "this woman was submerged hundreds of feet underwater in deeply hostile classified territories. She was running a pressurized nuclear reactor. Her job was to prevent a catastrophic casualty and keep my crew breathing. She was one of the very few women in a brutal, unforgiving environment, and her labor was not glamorous. It was dangerous, and it required a level of physical discipline none of you in this room could possibly survive." The lawyer opened his mouth to speak, but Chief Vance stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. "You want to talk about labor?" Chief Vance asked. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. He looked at the lawyer with the kind of intense disdain usually reserved for a broken steam valve. "I watched her work 18-hour shifts in an engine room that reached 110 degrees. I watched her burn her hands on high-pressure lines just to prove she belonged on those steel deck plates. She lived on stale coffee and ate ship food for 2 decades. She sat in total darkness and broke her own heart missing her children, just so she could send every single dime back home." Chief Vance turned and pointed a thick, heavily scarred finger directly at Robert. "She told me every single day that she was building a restaurant back home," Vance stated bluntly. "She did the bleeding so you could do the buying. She starved herself of a normal civilian life and of motherhood so you could play the executive." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. The two minority partners exchanged a long, deeply uncomfortable look. The narrative they had been sold was crumbling right in front of them. The deadbeat mother story had just been completely obliterated by 2 undeniable eyewitnesses who had seen my sacrifice firsthand. But character testimony is only half the battle. A submarine requires a torpedo to finish the engagement. I finally reached forward and opened my single thin manila folder. I pulled out the faded yellow carbon copy receipts and slid them down the polished wood directly toward the accountant. "Marcus," I said quietly, The lawyer showed you the final checks Robert wrote from the joint domestic account. I need you to review these original source documents and tell the board exactly where that money originated. Marcus nervously picked up the yellow receipts. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the heavily stamped military seals, my signature, and the official transfer dates. His eyes widened behind his lenses. These are certified military wire transfers, Marcus said, his voice rising in genuine shock. He looked up at the minority partners. This first document shows exactly $40,000 moving directly from a military hazardous duty pay account into the joint checking account exactly 4 days before the commercial lease check was written. This second document shows $60,000 from a military re-enlistment bonus deposited exactly 1 week before the massive commercial kitchen equipment was purchased. Marcus dropped the receipts onto the table and looked directly at Robert. Robert. Marcus said, his professional composure completely shattering. You explicitly told me the initial capital came from a family inheritance you personally managed. You intentionally omitted these military wire transfers from the financial history you provided to me. You submitted heavily sanitized, manipulated ledgers to this board. The trap snapped completely shut. The lawyer stared at the yellow receipts, his jaw tight. He slowly reached across the table and quietly pulled his $0 surrender document back toward his heavy leather binder. He knew it was over. He had based his entire aggressive legal strategy on a financial lie that was now exposed by undeniable hard copy proof. Submitting heavily doctored financial ledgers to a board of investors to orchestrate a fraudulent hostile takeover was a massive disbarment-level ethical violation. He was rapidly packing his briefcase, silently abandoning ship. Robert sat in stunned silence at the head of the table. The color had completely drained from his face. He was totally cornered. His perfect designer suit suddenly looked very small. He had gambled everything on the assumption that a guilty mother would quietly fold under a legal ambush. He had mistaken my silent trust during our marriage for absolute stupidity. The removal vote collapsed instantly. The minority partners leaned far away from him in their chairs, visibly disgusted by the financial deception. In the corporate business world, lying about the origin of capital makes you completely toxic. They realized he was a massive liability. Marcus, the swing vote, crossed his arms and glared at him. Accountants do not take kindly to being manipulated into participating in corporate fraud. Robert braced himself, his hands trembling on the mahogany table. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. He expected me to launch a massive, vindictive counterattack. He assumed I was going to demand full control of the business, fire him on the spot, and throw him out of the very restaurant he loved. He thought I was going to use this absolute victory to ruin his life out of sheer revenge. He assumed I was going to sink the boat. I looked at Robert. The sheer terror in his eyes was entirely genuine. The empire he had built on a foundation of sanitized ledgers, calculated lies, and weaponized maternal guilt was fracturing under the weight of the actual truth. He was bracing for a massive, destructive counterattack. He expected me to demand full operational control of the kitchen, fire him on the spot, and completely strip away his identity as the perfect primary parent and self-made executive. A lesser woman might have done exactly that. But a submarine sailor does not intentionally sink a seaworthy vessel just because the commanding officer goes rogue. You isolate the casualty, you cut away the dead weight, and you set a safe course for the surface so the crew can breathe. I am not going to take this restaurant from you, I told him quietly. The entire room paused. His lawyer stopped packing his leather briefcase. The two minority partners leaned forward, deeply confused by my complete lack of aggression. If I force a hostile takeover today, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly steady, I would destroy the equity I spent 20 years building in the dark. I would ruin the livelihoods of the 50 civilian employees working in your kitchen right now. I have absolutely zero interest in destroying this business out of spite. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it down the long mahogany table toward his lawyer. It was not a $0 surrender document. It was a mathematically precise, strictly fair buyout proposal I had drafted 3 nights ago in my sterile apartment. You can keep running the restaurant, I told Robert, my voice stripped of all emotion. You can keep the corner office. You can keep the title. But you will buy out my exact 50% stake at full current market value. Every single penny. You will secure a massive commercial loan if you have to. You will pay me exactly what my hazardous duty built, and then our business relationship will be permanently, cleanly severed. I looked at the minority partners and the accountant. If he refuses to sign this fair buyout, I told them, I will take these original yellow wire transfer receipts and I will formally sue him for corporate fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. I will freeze every single asset this restaurant possesses, and this business will not survive the legal process. I turned my attention back to Robert. It is a very simple choice, I said. You can sign a fair check and keep your empire, or you can fight me and I will mathematically sink the boat. The choice is yours. I did not wait for his answer. I did not need to. I had isolated the casualty, stopped the leak, and dictated the exact terms of my exit. I stood up, thanked Admiral David and Chief Vance for their time, and walked out of the private dining room. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the bright coastal sunlight. I took a deep breath of fresh, unmanufactured air. It was the best thing I had tasted in 20 years. The aftermath was completely clinical. Robert had absolutely no choice. The minority partners immediately threatened to withdraw their patio funding if he did not resolve the massive legal liability he had created. His lawyer strongly advised him to take my deal to avoid a crippling fraud investigation. Within 30 days, a massive wire transfer hit my brand new civilian bank account. It was exactly 50% of the restaurant's audited market value. The financial settlement gave me complete freedom. I bought a quiet, comfortable house near the ocean, far away from the busy commercial district. I spend my days repairing small diesel engines on fishing boats, enjoying the fresh air, and helping young women who are considering enlisting navigate their options. But more importantly, the truth gave me back my children. Word of the meeting quickly reached Sarah and Michael. When they realized their father had actively lied about my financial contributions and weaponized my military service to orchestrate a hostile takeover, the carefully constructed narrative completely shattered. They realized I had not abandoned them for a 20-year vacation from motherhood. I had simply gone into the dark to buy them a brighter future. We are slowly rebuilding our relationship now. It takes time, but the foundation is finally built on solid, undeniable truth. Robert kept his restaurant. He got exactly what he wanted, but he is completely alone in that back office now. The minority partners watch his every move with deep suspicion, demanding constant, rigorous audits. He rules his empire, but he is heavily leveraged by the massive commercial loan he had to take out to buy my freedom. When you spend your entire life turning heavy wrenches in the dark as a woman, you learn a very valuable lesson about human nature. Some people will gladly take your sacrifice, spend your hazardous duty pay, and then use your absence against you, trying to convince the world that you were just a bad mother who contributed absolutely nothing. They will mistake your quiet discipline for weakness. They will assume that because you carry the heavy guilt of being away, you do not know how to defend your worth. But true strength is never loud. True strength is knowing exactly what you built, knowing your worth as a mother and a veteran, keeping your receipts, and refusing to let anyone else rewrite your history. The truth does not need a microphone. The truth only needs time, discipline, and undeniable proof. When the pressure hits, the loudest voices always break, and the quiet anchors hold firm. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. I share new stories of quiet resilience and earned justice every week. And let me know in the comments below, do you think I should have aggressively taken full control of the restaurant just to teach him a lesson? Or was walking away with a clean payout the right strategic move? I review every single comment. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next video where a ruthless stepson tries to evict a female veteran from her own home, completely unaware of the trust document locked in the basement safe.